Welcome back to the Evolving Warfighter. My name is Dr. Franklin Annis, and today we're going to be talking about cyber warfare and using fiction to advance our military self-development. I'm blessed to have two fine gentlemen here with me today to have this conversation. They recently authored a book called Rules of Engagement that will be released on the 23rd of June. Both of these fine gentlemen are graduates of the U.S. U.S. Naval Academy. They're both career Navy and retired now. David Bruns served as an officer of a nuclear-powered submarine, and he's authored over a dozen novels. And J.R. Olson served for 21 years as an intelligence officer and is a graduate of the U.S. Naval War College. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting us to join you. Yeah.
Let me begin by saying I thoroughly enjoyed the chance to read your books, Rules of Engagement, and I appreciate St. Martin's Press reaching out for me to have a chance to read it early. I have to confess I initially turned it down because I typically don't read books of fiction. I typically read more history or personal accounts of warfare.
Yep.
But I'm glad I changed my mind because this was rather refreshing, and I found it a quite interesting way of explaining some of the major topics that affect our military now in a narrative fashion that might tie all these kind of loose stories together that might not be explained very well if you took them one at a time. So it kind of explains how a lot of different things can be combined to have kind of grand campaigns or strategic impacts that we may not initially think about. So excellent book, and I definitely highly recommend it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
From my understanding, I've been told this is your third novel working together, writing together. And every book was written to be a standalone book, although there's some characters that are common among your novels. Can you tell me why you decided to go with the theme of cyber warfare for this novel?
When we started working together, it's 5 years ago now, so it's been quite a while. When we first started working together, we wanted to write books that sort of were like the thrillers that we grew up with, sort of the Tom Clancy thriller, which were these big global issues and globe-trotting type thrillers. And back to your opening comment, one of the reasons that we think these kinds of thrillers are pretty effective is because you're telling through a narrative type style, and you're actually perhaps teaching a few lessons along the way. But to answer your question, on each book we take a major current topic. So in our first book, which was Weapons of Mass Deception, it's about nuclear proliferation, specifically through non-state actors. The second book was called Jihadi Apprentice, and it was about homegrown radicalism, and that actually grew out of news stories we started seeing here in our local Minneapolis hometown paper. And when we talked about starting a third book, the thing that we really wanted to tackle was cyber warfare. And the reason why we wanted to do it is because we started working on this book in 2016, and you were just starting to see some of the major hacks that are now commonplace were just starting to come out in the news then. And we sort of knew that this was an up-and-coming hybrid strategy that other countries, specifically weaker countries, were going to try to exploit against the United States and against other countries. So we wanted to dig into that topic and through storytelling, expand on it and show people perhaps what could be the possibilities out of that.
Okay, that makes sense. In your book, you use the example of a virus changing a single digit to have really catastrophic effects in a power plant. And most of the times when we think about viruses, it's usually this grand program that changes a whole bunch of things.
Yep.
Do you believe that, well, when I read it, it really makes the concept of a cyber attack more realistic. But could you kind of take a moment to describe what might be the likely cyber attacks that we'd see in the real world, or what that might look like outside of the kind of the Hollywood thriller?
Well, we want to highlight first off that neither David nor I are experts on cyber operations. But we think we can craft a pretty good yarn where we incorporate as relatively technically accurate as we understand it to fashion that storyline. So you were mentioning the idea of changing one digit. So the idea behind that is, I don't know if you've ever heard the term SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition.
Okay.
So that's a very commonly used control system to try and basically get a handle on a highly complex system of systems. So think along the lines of the control room for a nuclear reactor, or the control center for a major power grid in and of itself, or a water reclamation system, or an oil refinery. All these kinds of very big, complex systems. You can't have somebody at each gauge throughout the entire system, right? So you put sensors on all those different mechanisms around the whole complex, and they all feed back to a central hub. So that's what SCADA is. In the modern digital world, all of that stuff is controlled through computers, and on control screens in front of you, all of that, the readouts are all displayed. So the idea behind this particular instance that you're referring to is that a system would be compromised by a series of codes that would go in and make it look like everything is in the green. It's all operating perfectly. But behind the screens, there's actually a whole bunch of things going wrong. Now, if you're familiar with the Stuxnet worm that took down a bunch of the Iranian centrifuges in their nuclear research program, that is essentially what was happening with the Stuxnet program. Is it was designed to basically make the SCADA control network look like it was functioning perfectly, but behind the scenes, those centrifuges were spinning up much faster than they were designed to handle, and thus breaking. And so that's kind of, we took that 0-day documentary film as good instruction for how you might use cyber in a modern hybrid warfare scenario, if that answers the question.
Oh yes, it does. Well, and the Iranian centrifuge kind of situation was the one thing that came to mind when I was reading that chapter.
Yep. Yeah, it was basically playing off of that. Is that in an industrial setting, you're going to do something that's not apparent to an operator because you want to fool the operator, right? And but you also want it to be simple enough that it's not going to be easily found.
Right.
Another kind of topic or issue that came up in your book is the question is cyber warfare kind of the field leveler that it doesn't require as much, it doesn't require significant resources to engage in cyber warfare as like traditional militaries. So are these kind of smaller powers or rogue states around the world, are they more likely to maybe seek cyber attack scenarios because they have limited resources and this might be the best way to engage versus trying to, fight a conventional style of warfare?
Yeah, I think it actually goes deeper than that because nobody wants to take on the U.S. military in a conventional warfare setting. Russia doesn't. There's no country on earth that thinks that that's a good idea. But what they would like to do is they would like to disable the country in other ways or degrade capabilities. So the Stuxnet virus is a great example of, in this case, the United States in conjunction with Israel.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. In trying to degrade capabilities without using open warfare. But that cuts both ways, right? If we can do it to them, you can bet they can probably do it to us. So one of the side effects that we hopefully would have from a book like this is to raise the consciousness and to maybe raise the level of conversation around cyber warfare. Because right now it's still, although we're talking about it more, we're talking about it in very hyped up and tend to be very political terms. But it's not really a political problem. It's a systemic problem, and it's actually and we're going to continue to see more of it. And one of the things, and I'm sure that we'll get to this later, is the difficulty of attribution, because nobody sends in a computer virus that says made by Russia, right? You have to figure out where it came from, and you have to look at a bunch of telltale signs so you can trace it back to where it came from, and that can take a while. And you further get into the situation of when you're attacked in a cyber warfare arena, what is the appropriate response? Is the appropriate response an armed response? Or in our case, does it just take over and do it on its own?
Yeah, and to echo a little bit about what David is saying here, we were lucky enough to have a senior officer visit Minnesota a couple of years ago, and I actually asked him that question, this flag officer, you know, what has National Command Authority determined yet at what point a cyber attack becomes an act of war? And he started laughing, and he said, you know, we've been struggling with that. And he said the basic response is that we'll know it when we see it. And I think that's probably a good way to approach it, because you have to sort of assess what are the impacts of that cyber action. Does it cause death or destruction, or does it just disrupt things, right? And further to David's point about nobody wants to take on the U.S. military, I had an opportunity to see an interview with Lieutenant General McMaster, former National Security Advisor. He was giving a lecture at one point, and he quoted somebody, I don't remember the name of the guy who he quoted, and you might know this, Franklin, but the quote is, there are two ways to take on the U.S. military, asymmetrically and stupidly. So cyber offers you that opportunity to use sort of asymmetric approach, a kind of a hybrid approach, along with a whole host of other things that we probably will see going forward in the future. And it's only limited by the amount of brain power you can put on that problem. Because if you have, you know, 1,000 really capable computer programmers, hackers, people who really understand how to get inside code and whatnot, they could do an unbelievable amount of damage with the right motivation.
Well, the idea of proportionality is really kind of a big question now I think about it. It's like, how would you respond if someone, you know, took down the power and just made it hard to deliver groceries? Like, what would be an appropriate response?
Right.
Something I'll have to definitely think about in the future. So throughout history, we've always seen men that are willing to kind of sell their skills as mercenaries to enter the battlefield, and I could see this becoming a very easy way for kind of very highly technical, skilled individuals to kind of sell their skills to enter cyber warfare. Do you think that will be more of a challenge moving into the future as kind of professional cyber warriors that are freelance?
I think so. And in fact, I've been reading reports that, you know, Russian intelligence has actually been sort of contracting with people rather than, you know, so they have that plausible deniability, that they're using freelancers to go out and do things to disrupt U.S. or our allied systems, networks, and things like that.
So Franklin, a book that a nonfiction book, actually, that's right along this line. David Sanger's book, The Perfect Weapon, which was unfortunately published after we finished all the research for our book, is really an excellent book on a lot of these topics. It goes in detail on Stuxnet. It goes in detail on Nitro Zeus, which was the plan to launch a cyber attack to presage an invasion on Iran. And it talks a lot about proportionality. It talks a lot about how we're not really having a national conversation or a global conversation really about probably one of the most destructive weapons that exists. I mean, and the U.S. is especially vulnerable. We have a lot of attack surfaces. Our lives are very digital. All of our services are digital. So if somebody wants to do some damage, there's a lot of opportunity out there for people who are not changing their passwords and, you know, doing all those other digital hygiene type things.
Well, not only that, but, you know, this whole kerfuffle that's going on right now over Huawei, right? 5G enables the entire globe to move to the true Internet of Things, Internet of everything, right? And we will be living in a true digital world, not the material world that Madonna told us about, you know, a few decades ago, but the digital world. Which means that if you have the Internet of Things and you have backdoors into those systems through security processes, you could do some incredible disruption when everybody and everything they own is connected to the internet, right? Could be a very interesting world in the future.
Yeah, I mean, my kids are in their 20s, and I'm not sure they've ever used a paper map. So I mean, when you think about, I mean, what we do with our phones and in our cars and on computers versus what we did just 20 years ago, and how an entire generation has grown up, you know, without having to resort to those backup methods, it could be a painful event.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's an incredible understatement.
And as an example of that, so I just finished teaching for the spring term at Carleton College yesterday, and I had a student come and visit me yesterday afternoon, and he's a student from another country, so he's a foreign student coming here to study in America. We got onto this subject of kind of the global digital connections that are forming everywhere. And he said to me, you know, I said to him, you know, people at your age spend all their time basically on their smartphones. They do literally everything on their smartphone. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, he goes, I don't understand why anybody would use a laptop anymore. As I'm sitting at my desk with my laptop in front of me. Like, I'm the dinosaur now. Okay, well, yeah. Apparently that's the way it goes.
I really enjoyed one aspect of your novel because I get really heavily into the concept of talent management, but I love the idea that in your novel you have midshipmen, which is essentially in the Army, we call them cadets, that were utilized for cyber defense. So the thought, I'm assuming here, is that technology is moving so far ahead that maybe our strategic leaders or even our operational leaders are too far behind in terms of generations to understand the technology. So we may have to kind of figure out a way to jump kind of leadership or talent and ability down to kind of the younger folks that may be more in tune to growing up with this technology. Could you talk about how you got that idea for your novel?
The U.S. Naval Academy started a cybersecurity studies program a few years ago. And so I was class of 90 at the Naval Academy. David was 88. A guy in between us, Paul Tortora, class of 89, actually runs that whole program at Annapolis. And they have won, his teams have won a couple of national competitions and have been invited to the White House a couple of times as winners of these competitions. So it's a very strong program at Annapolis. And they're building an entire new academic hall called Hopper Hall after Grace Hopper that will be a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility, where midshipmen will go and learn the basics of cybersecurity and then more advanced cyber operations, cybersecurity studies, et cetera, long term. So we were really excited about that potential for the future. Sort of sparked the creative juices going about, you know, how do we use that in the future? And as David was mentioning just a few minutes ago, the kids that are, you know, younger today, under the age of 25, I mean, they are essentially digital natives. You know, to them, it's almost like the way they think about how everything is connected and how they use electronic devices and communicate and whatnot, it is like breathing for them. They don't even think about it. So the younger you go, the more likely you are to get people who are truly current on the technology. So much so that the Air Force just, I think, if I read this recently, just started looking into bringing their very first enlisted UAV or drone pilots into the programs, because here you got kids who've grown up playing all these really high-end, you know, video games, online, you know, massive online role-playing games and whatnot, and they are really good at it with all these competitions that exist out there today. So why not put them to work doing what they do very, very well in support, in defense of the country? That's probably a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Dave, do you want to add any of that?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, cyber is really the fifth domain. You know, you have air, sea, land, space, and now you have cyber. And if you go back to when the Army Air Corps was formed and when the Navy pilot program started, you were taking younger people, right? Because you were starting a brand new technology, and frankly, they were willing to do it, right? And I think that this is just the same thing. This is a generational thing, and it's good that we can draw on those resources. And so we're both Naval Academy graduates, so we also wanted to pay a little tribute back to Mother Bancroft, and and the advent of the cyber studies. I think it opens next year, right? The Grace
I think
Hopper
that's right.
cyber studies program, which will be literally world class. Skiff compartments in the building, the whole schmear. So it will be an amazing facility, and we hope we get to tour it. The U.S. Naval Institute Press Proceedings also got an advanced copy of the book and loved it, and left a great review that said something to the effect of, anybody who's in the Navy or a midshipman or senior leadership needs to read this book, which we think is a great point.
Well, it's interesting you brought up the point where with major changes in the military, or we hit stages where we have to do kind of major innovations, like targeting the younger generations may actually be a big advantage, because I think, well, after spending, decades in the service, you have a kind of understanding of how you would see warfare, and you kind of need someone that hasn't been trained in the traditional methods to invent the new.
Right.
As our cybersecurity advances, it's going to become more and more difficult to hack the actual computer programs, and I think you're starting to see more targeted approaches to trying to hack the human behind the computer system. So instead of reaching from computer to computer, it's reaching from computer to an individual to get past the security systems that compromise the security systems, or basically avoid all the protection systems.
Yep.
You have a great story of an individual that gets compromised and put in a really bad situation. And when I read the chapter, I can kind of really relate to the individual where you could see that type of person in the service, that the service has become everything for them. All of a sudden they're compromised. They have the choice between doing the right thing and reporting what happened, or trying to hide and protect their career. I was hoping that you would share that story with the audience and kind of explain what could possibly happen.
We'll let the ex-intel officer take that.
So traditionally speaking, from a U.S. perspective, when we talk about human intelligence operations, clandestine strategic level human ops, we have found that coercion is a really, really bad methodology to recruit somebody. You generally want to get them, to recruit them to work for American interests on much more positive terms. But it is highly true that other countries around the world, they will use coercive methods to bring people into the fold to work for them, and they've done it in the past, and sadly it's unfortunately been effective, right? So this particular character, we don't want to give too much of the story away, was an individual that we talked through quite a bit, trying to figure out what his personality and motivations would be, because that's what an intelligence operative, a case officer would kind of key on. What are the kind of motivational things that I can hit to convince that individual to do what I need him or her to do in the interests of American national security? In this case, our character that you're referring to is somebody who is, committed to service, patriotic, but he is a highly flawed individual. And, he's basically been able to sort of squeak through the system. He's not particularly popular with anybody, but he's relatively effective at his job. But he's got some flaws, and they're taken advantage of, as you mentioned. So that's kind of how we developed that particular character. We needed a way into that particular system, and he seemed like a good candidate to use. You want to add to that, David, on the character development side?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit later about how we write together, but the short version of it is we sort of talk through the broad outlines, and J.R. puts the details together, and I do most of the writing, right? So it's interesting because J.R.'s got the background and the experience in this case, And so I get a high level explained to me, and I sort of fill in things, and then he goes back and he reads it. He says, well, this is all right, but this is not how this part would happen. You need to beef up this part here. So building that character and making him believable, but also at the same time he's betraying his country, and and not to give anything away, but does he break later, and does he come clean? We talk through, would this kind of person do that, right? Or would he double down and stick it out to the end? So the answer, but people can read the story for themselves and make their own determination.
So a great real life instance of that is the now imprisoned for life former FBI counterintelligence specialist Robert Hansen, right? And Hollywood did, I think, a pretty good job of bringing out all these character flaws in the movie Breach when they talk about Hansen and all the things that he had done during his career as a spy for the Soviet Union and then Russia. And that movie does a pretty good job of explaining kind of the motivational factors, the psychology behind a guy like Robert Hansen. And I think my personal opinion is that the way we crafted our character, there are some of these same flaws in that character that exist in a lot of people who wind up becoming spies for other countries here in America. So it's a story that sadly happens all too frequently, and there's a lot of damage to take. But Aldrich Ames is another great example, right? Nicholson is another example. So there's a lot to draw on there in the real world events on the counterintelligence side that help inform us as we create a character like this individual.
Well, I have to say I love the way you wrote your book, because your chapters are very short but yet very self-contained, and I think this chapter, among many other chapters, would be great for like military book clubs or even small units to say, hey, just read this chapter, these 13 pages, and we're going to talk about this character and what we'd really do if we found ourselves in that situation, and just kind of the moral question, the ethical question,
right, exactly.
would be an excellent one to examine.
Yeah, because the reality of it is, if that individual, when the thing happened, had gone to his command immediately and said this happened, he wouldn't have been. I mean, he was compromised, but he wouldn't have been compromised the way he actually was, right?
Yeah.
And he chose not to do that. And you can call it a moral flaw or a character trait or whatever you want to call it, but the guy on the other end, the bad guy, took advantage of that.
And the cover-up is always much worse than the initial crime.
Yes. For the audience out there, if you get in trouble, come out and tell your commanders that you got in trouble and solve the problem.
Yeah.
Try to hide it.
The old saying goes in the military, right? Bad news does not get better with time.
Very true. So I greatly enjoyed this book because it really highlights trying to think like the enemy and using that as a concept to kind of take a look at our systems and how we would essentially, if we acted as the rogue state, how would we attack ourselves to try to figure out where our weaknesses are, where our vulnerabilities might be. And for that reason, I think your novel is a really great a thought experiment in the way that you could examine several different vulnerabilities or ways that you might be attacked. Could you talk about if there was any specific way that you created your storyline? Because it seemed like you have basically a list of several different types of attacks that are kind of unique, but they roll up into kind of a major campaign.
So I think most of the attacks, we tended to base the smaller attacks building up to the big one on ones that had happened, right? So the breach at the Office of Personnel Management, we already talked about Stuxnet. So we use several things like that where we use them because in the public reporting that has come out since, you've got details, right, that you can use to make it more realistic. Now the big hack at the end is obviously created by us, and like in all of our novels, we try to take the action and we want to turn it up to 11. So making two navies go at each other because of a computer virus is that's about as big as it gets, right? But I think the answer to your question is whenever possible, we try to use existing scenarios or leverage off of existing scenarios to add more reality to the situation. Because if someone says, well, that could never happen, you say, oh, really? Well, have you watched the movie 0 Days and learned about Stuxnet? Because that exactly did happen, right? Where you're taking you're changing one factor, just like you were talking about earlier, one factor in a pretty complex system, and the whole thing goes kaboom.
Yeah. And then further to your point, I think as the action heats up, right, and missiles start flying and everything else, we tried to create a realistic combat scenario that might take place. But you probably noted that our young midshipmen figure out this is kind of a haphazard approach, right? You wouldn't normally execute warfare this way, which is a good indicator that something is different about this.
Yes.
And hopefully that helps spark some interest amongst those who might wish to read this to see how it all plays out.
Definitely an exciting book. It'll draw you in, especially towards the end where you're... I had a chance to read this like one chapter at a time, riding back and forth on a bus in DC. So every time I jumped in the bus, it's like, okay, I got to figure out whether or not we're going to survive the next chapter or not.
Well, it's funny you should say that, Frank, because a couple of times I've given a copy of our books to a neighbor, and he came over a couple of weeks later and he had the book. He was like 3/4 of the way through. He says, you know what I really like about this book? He says, I can only read like one chapter a night. He says, but it's just enough. And he says, I read it and I'm like, oh, I can't read another chapter, but I really want to read another chapter. He says, so it's not too long, but it's not too short either. He says, I get a complete story in 4, 5, 6 pages, right? And then I can move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, you not to give too much away, but you did some pretty significant things that I'm sure will, catch attention. Like if you have an aircraft carrier sinking somewhere in the you're gonna wake up the Navy and terrify people. But it's the reality we have to face today, whether or not the aircraft carrier makes sense in the modern battlefield. I'd like to get a little bit into the writing process.
Sure.
So the thing I know is the writing is always consistent. I think you kind of tipped your hat, but how did you two work together to make sure the consistencies of the chapter was there and it made sense that you didn't have like two different speakers in your book?
So we can give you a little background of kind of how we came together as a writing team,
okay,
and that might help inform this question a little bit, the answer to this question. We were speaking as Naval Academy grads to the Naval Academy Parents Club here in Minnesota a little over 5 years ago now. And David gave his background, the time he spent in submarines and then his corporate career, and he finally decided he'd had enough of working for the man, and he threw off the shackles and decided to take up the career as a professional writer. Then I, gave my spiel about my career in naval intelligence and whatnot. And one of the parents stood up at the end of our discussion. They said, "You two ought to get together and write a book." So David gave me a call about a week later, and he said, "Hey, you want to go out to lunch?" And I knew exactly why he was calling me. I said, "Sure." So as soon as he actually, proposed that question at lunch, I was all over it. And frankly, I was pretty excited about the idea of trying to do something that was very creative, even though it was highly complex and it would take a lot of commitment, primarily because a friend asked me to join him on that adventure. And so we had some ideas right off the bat about what a first story might look like, and that eventually became Weapons of Mass Deception. And it was kind of funny because at the beginning we were trying to figure out, well, how do two type A personality guys trained to lead work collaboratively in a creative environment, right? Who's going to be in charge here? And we both realized that you can't really have one person be in charge and the other person be subordinate. That's not really a good collaborative working environment. So what we wound up doing was, we each wrote a couple of chapters and exchanged it, And frankly, I mean, I'm a narrative writer. David's writing skills are better than mine. He has the ability to really go in and create characters that you really like and believe. And he brings the story out through dialogue, which is, I just don't have that skill when I write. I can narratively tell a story, but he brings it to life through the dialogue and the background of his characters. And I really like that much better, frankly. So what we set about to do at that point was to create the story arc and then sort of initial story outlines. We got together, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 times with the first book, and we'd sort of plot out 6 or 8 chapters. I'd go in and do detailed chapter outlines and give those to David. Sometimes I got back what I outlined, and sometimes I got back stuff that was completely on tangent, but it was always good. And what we found is that process for the first book took a really long time. A lot of back and forth, a lot of having to go back and change things earlier in the story because we sort of changed the trajectory later on. And so we learned a lot about the working relationship in that first book. And we changed a lot of things as we headed into building Jihadi Apprentice and then certainly Rules of Engagement. I don't know, do you want to pick up from there, David, on what we did for Jihadi?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the way you want to think about it is he's the fact and I'm the fiction. So when we start a book, like Jihadi Apprentice was actually a great example. The way that book came about was in 2015, and in the paper here in Minneapolis, we have a very large Somali community. I think it's the second largest Somali community in the world. There was a lot of stories in the paper about young people being radicalized and getting on planes and going to Turkey and ended up in Syria or ending up fighting for Al-Shabaab or ISIS. And it was a real, I mean, it was a lot of heartache here. And we took an interest in that topic and worked with the FBI here, got some contacts into the Somali community to do the research. But when we started to write the book, we had the idea and we had the research, and then we talked through a story arc. And what we ended up doing was J.R. went away and did basically a very large detailed story outline. And so we had talked through the big tentpole moments of what this story arc looks like, and he filled in all this stuff that has to come between those big moments. And I got an outline, and including all the research, which there's a considerable amount of research that goes into a book like this. And I'm not big on research, so JR does all the heavy lifting on the front end. I get it. I can write very quickly. If I get an outline within probably 6 or 8 weeks, I can have a finished draft of a book. And then I sent it to JR and I said, okay, is this what we wanted? And he says, well, this is good, but why did you do this? And because sometimes I get in the outline and I say, what if this happened? And I end up going off on, I do a hard right, and turns out I should have done a hard left. So through that back and forth process, I mean, the first book, it was a lot of back and forth because we were trying to figure out our path. The second book was less back and forth, but still a pretty ping-pongy process. And by the time we wrote the third book, which is Rules of Engagement, we had a pretty locked-in process. So we sort of brainstormed the story idea. We brainstormed the big tentpole moments. JR went away and worked for 2-3 months, and we occasionally had a meeting and he'd talk through some of the details. And I got a book to write the book, essentially, with pictures and links and YouTube videos and all kinds of details that I was then able to use to write the finished story. So he gives me the skeleton. I put the meat on the bones.
Yeah. And one of the things that I really appreciated about this partnership is we promised each other right at the very beginning that we would do everything we could to make sure we were as technically accurate as we could be on military weapons systems, on intelligence community, organizational structure, and all those kinds of things, because we like reading those national security thrillers that are accurate. They're technically accurate, believable, where you have characters who are very real, they're vulnerable, and yet they manage to succeed in situations that are really beyond their control, really. They just do what they can to survive through those situations and happen to have success. So we got pretty good at that, and I don't remember how many pages the book was for Rules of Engagement, because that was a little while ago now. So we have a fourth book that's in the works right now, and I know that that was a 208-page outline that I gave David.
Yes, yes. It's now a doorstop in my office. Yeah.
So one interesting aspect of kind of you moving on in your careers post-military and writing these military thrillers, how did your kind of unique aspects of your own military careers allow you to kind of engage in this type of writing?
Yeah, so this comes back to the fact and the fiction. So, I mean, I got out of the Navy in '94, and I was not in the reserves after that. So my day to day, I still have two brothers who did full careers. So I sort of kept a toe in the water. But in terms of day to day interaction with the military, I didn't really have it. So I went into private sector and spent a lot of time overseas, but a lot of time in China, a lot of time in Southeast Asia. So I got to see the business side of things and the boardroom side of things and how customers act on the ground. So when we talk about things like industrial espionage or what does Beijing look like, I've got those details. JR was in for much longer, saw a lot of different things, a lot of different operations, and we can bring the flavor of all those things to it. I mean, one of the things JR mentioned a couple minutes ago that I just want to circle back on is after when we were prepping for this book launch and as we're writing the fourth book, we started thinking about what's the thing that ties all these books together. And yes, it's the characters, but really it's the common denominator of what we're really writing about are heroes. I mean, we're a lot of time we talk about role models and about moral leaders and things, and we like to look at the guy who's, on a basketball team or in politics or something. And I mean, a lot of times the heroes are the people who are in uniform and you never know their name. So these are people who are put into extraordinary situations and have to work with what they have to make it happen. And that's what our books are really about. That's the thread that actually ties them through. Because we write with a cast of characters, there's like a lead character in each novel. So in this novel, it was Don Riley. In Jihadi Apprentice, it was FBI agent or a special agent Liz Sarouche. It was Brendan McHugh, who was a Navy SEAL who was injured in our first book. So we work with that cast of character, but the thread, the thing that ties them all together is the fact that they're really, in our mind, they're heroes. And these are people that we've worked with for years, both in uniform and as public servants, and that's the kind of thing that we think about as we're writing these books, and we're much more, I think, aware of it now too. And I forget what your actual question was, frankly. I got off on a tangent.
Well, how your military career prepared you to kind of take on this alternate career of writing?
So as David mentioned, I was commissioned in '90, and I wound up doing 21 years on active duty. I retired as a commander out of Naval Intelligence 8 years ago now, a little over 8 years ago. I can't believe it's gone by that quickly. But as an intel officer, you do a lot of kind of traditional naval intelligence jobs. My first job was with an E-2 Hawkeye squadron with a carrier air wing embarked in USS Ranger for her last deployment. And then I was on Constellation for a workup for a second cruise, and then I departed there. Went to 4 years at U.S. Special Operations Command, so had went from a traditional big Navy carrier strike group operating environment to the special ops world, where I got a chance to see everything from the Tier 1 on down. So that was a really eye-opening experience. And I screened for, was selected, and went through training with the CIA after that to become a case officer. So then I did some time as a strategic level plan HUMINT collector, recruiting spies. I went from there to the Naval War College, earned a master's degree there, and then came back onto the Navy staff after that to help rebuild the Navy HUMINT program. So this idea of going out and recruiting young people who were super talented, I did that to bring them into these kind of high-end programs. And these kinds of experiences that you have while you're on active duty. And there are other military, retired authors who were in the military, or retired military who are now authors, who bring to life the experiences that they had while they were on active duty. And I think that's one of those things that kind of drives us to be technically accurate without giving away those things that would actually be classified, right?
Yes.
Because we do not want to put all those heroes that are out there in uniform today in harm's way by something stupid that we put into a book trying to make money. That's not what we're about.
Yeah.
We want to tell a great story, but we still want to be technically accurate so it can be as believable as possible for those who read.
Do you have any advice for any service members that might want to consider writing fiction in terms of how to get into the field or how to approach it?
So I would say try it. So two things. It's probably the best time to be a writer now. So Amazon and places like that have really broken down a lot of barriers in terms of, I mean, in this case, this is our third book. We did find an agent. We did sign with a big New York publisher, but our first two books were crowdfunded and were independently published. And they're everybody's good as this book. You know, there is one of the side effects of the changes within the publishing industry is that there are a lot of freelance editors, very good copy editors out there. There's a lot of freelance developmental editors if you need help shaping the story. And there's a ton of tools that you can use to get through the publishing process. It's not that hard, especially after you go through it once. So I think a lot of people have a story to tell, and I would encourage them to tell it. J.R. mentioned this before, and I think when we first started working together, we really had no idea how it would work. And we tried a bunch of stuff, and some of it worked and some of it didn't. And since then, I've done other collaborations, and I can tell you that each one is different because each person comes to that collaboration wanting something, and in a lot of cases, not even knowing what it is or what their real strengths are in that relationship. So, you know, sorting that out takes about a year, and I've done a couple of collaborations now. So if you have a friend and you want to try a collaboration, I would say try it. It's entirely possible it'll go down in a fiery ball, and that's okay, right? I mean, you can look back and you say, well, at least I tried, right? And, you know, look, writing books is if you think you're going to do it for the money, you should disabuse yourself of that notion right now because we put in a lot. I mean, if we were paid by the hour, we wouldn't even be making minimum wage.
No.
So we put in a lot of hours, but we do it because we want to do it. And we do it because we've got great stories to tell and because people want to hear them. And anyone who's, you know, exiting the military and thinks that they have a great unclassified story to tell, you know, I think they should get a laptop or get a pen and paper and tell it.
Yeah. The other thing too about doing it in a collaboration, right, is if you're writing all by yourself, you might hit a wall, right? You might write yourself into a corner and not know how to get out of it. And the great thing about having a collaborative approach is we can bounce a lot of ideas off each other as we're developing the overall storyline. And when I sit down with David and I go through chapter by chapter what's going to happen, he always hits me with great questions like, well, I don't see the transition here, or, you know, we got to make that more clear or whatever. So I go back to the drawing board. And so that collaborative approach keeps us out of trouble when we finally get into the actual writing of the story.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I would actually suggest a first-time author might want to try a collaborative approach first because, you know, many hands make light work as you get through that first effort, and then maybe branch off and try writing on your own. I'm very happy working with David on these national security thrillers. And so, you know, I'm going to stay the course as long as he wants to do it.
Yeah, because I mean, I've written, you know, a dozen or so novels, and you always hit a wall in every single one, from the first one to the most recent one. I've always hit a wall where you all of a sudden say to yourself, yeah, this is not working. I don't know what I'm doing. I know I've written 12 novels, but this one is not going to happen. And especially if you get stuck on a plot thing, having someone you can call who knows the story as well as you do, because they help prepare it, right? And you can say, look, this is what's going on, and this is where we are, and this is what I got, and I don't know what to do. And they say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And you say, well, yeah. And, you know, you don't have that when you're by yourself.
Yeah.
And it can get pretty lonely at times.
And if you know, since you've read the book, Franklin, you know that we have a large cast of characters, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot to keep track of. You want to have somewhat equal screen time, as it were, for all of your core protagonists and even your core antagonists, because you want to have time to develop those characters. And that's probably a little harder to keep track of for authors who are, working all by themselves. There are plenty of authors who are very talented out there who've done it, who've managed to do it. So, it's not impossible, of course. But it's kind of nice to have somebody to collaborate with as you build the background story, the backstory on all these different characters, and then keep track of them as they go through the whole storyline.
Yeah, I must say that you kind of had a unique ability to develop characters, because I think that you gave just enough information in every chapter that, number one, I've never in your book did I ever encounter and say like, oh, I couldn't think of someone like this in the military, because I always had someone that I could pull up and be like, oh, okay, I know this type of individual. But you kind of gave little incremental character developments that whenever you encountered a new character, you never knew, like, is this character just going to die 2 pages later, or is this character going to be throughout the storyline? So, the level of detail that you got into your characters, I must say, you struck an exceptional balance between enough to make the character believable and relatable, but not overwhelming for the lesser characters, and not. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm explaining that correctly, but other than say it's very good.
Yeah, having a large cast of characters can be dangerous, right? So if you think of Game of Thrones, right, and if you've read the Game of Thrones books, which I mean are amazing, 800 pages of them for each one, you will get to a chapter and you'll see a name and you're like, who's that guy again? And that's a danger. And we're very cognizant of it, because, you need to have enough characters to fill the story out. And because we do write with a cast of characters and we have one lead, it can be a big challenge. And that's also where having somebody to check you, because if I get the outline and I write it and I give it back to JR, if he can't follow it, then we got a problem. And there's plenty of editing that goes on after I give it to him.
One of the other things we do cognitively as we're developing the whole story is we'll actually kind of set out a matrix, and we'll say, okay, each of these characters, which chapters do they show up in? And we try and make sure that we actually get a good, nice spread all the way across, so that all the core characters get roughly even screen time. And that's a good kind of mechanism to use to keep track of your characters, and that way they stay fresh in everybody's mind as the reader's going through the story.
So I think you tipped your hat. So now that Rules of Engagement is going to be published this month, you said that you're working on your next project. Can you tell us the main theme of the next project and when we might see that?
So you may see sort of a theme to our stories so far: weapons of mass deception, kind of loose nukes, proliferation of nukes through non-state actors. The second one was heavily focused on terrorism, Jihadi Apprentice, and retribution to a certain extent. This one, you have an interplay between an active terrorist, state sponsorship, cyber, and some potentially really dangerous results from that, right? So the fourth one might contain a storyline that has something to do with sort of like the weapons of mass destruction kind of a theme, right? Because all of these major national security issues are on everybody's mind in the intelligence community every single day. And from my perspective as a career intel guy, the thing that terrified me the most was somebody actually succeeding in creating some sort of a weaponized bio agent. And maybe we leave you with that.
Okay, that's fair enough. So with that, especially for the audience out there, how do we follow you gentlemen to keep track of the works coming out? Do you have social media or websites that we could visit?
Best way to follow us is to go to the website, which is my name, David Bruns. It's B-R-U-N-S. It's not Burns, it's Bruns. So it's Burns, B-U-R-N-S, but it's not that. It's Bruns, B-R-U-N-S. There's a readers group, which you can pick up a free story if you sign up for that, and you can also look at all the books there. It'll give a little deeper background about who we are and some of the stuff we've done. And there is a Facebook page, which again is my name, David Bruns, B-R-U-N-S, author, which we also post there. I think the website is actually the best source of information, though.
Okay. Well, I thank you, gentlemen, for your time and joining me today. I definitely encourage the audience to go out and take a look at the rules of engagement, whether you're just reading it for your own self-development. This is an excellent book for a book club. If you have small groups of soldiers or sailors you can meet with to discuss the chapters, almost every chapter would have a different type of conversation that you could have to really pull out. Can't really endorse it enough. Like I said before, it should be released June 25th. Most major retailers like Amazon have it at a discount now if you pre-order. I checked it this morning and I believe it's $18.29 for a hard copy on Amazon right now.
Oof.
I know I have a copy pre-ordered for my father because I remember him growing up and having stacks of Clancy books around. So hopefully he enjoys his birthday present. Excellent book again, gentlemen, and I'm glad that I took the risk and read something fiction for a while instead of another history book.
Thank you for doing it.
Franklin, it's been a
Thank you for
pleasure.
having us.
Thank you.
And for the audience out there, I invite you to subscribe to the Evolving Warfighter for more videos on military self-development, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you.